Robert, welcome back to the Policy Scoop. Third time, our most precious guest on the show so far.
Thank you. Glad to continue to be invited.
And ever since her apologies, she's caught something, so she couldn't make today. But yeah, she shared some thoughts with me in advance as well. So I'm going to bring her questions to the table too.
Okay.
But yeah, big topic today. One that I know you've done quite a lot of work on. And when we started planning this, it was on the back of your latest article. But then we also had the huge IMO decision. So maybe, I don't know if we want to start there, but what do you make of what happened at the IMO and I guess how the US is trying to screw up what had been achieved so far?
Yeah, I mean, the IMO net zero framework that was set up for adoption, and it looked like they had the votes. They only need 2/3 only, but it's not like the UN when anyone can block it. You need 2/3 majority, but the US have been bullying states into voting no because they don't want the global carbon tax. And we don't need to go into all the details of what the net zero framework would have looked like, but essentially it would be, first of a kind, mandating shipping companies to using more and more low carbon fuel to reduce their emissions, and with pretty harsh penalties if you didn't comply, and also using the penalties to fund decarbonization. CDR was not a part of it, so it doesn't affect CDR. And what it means for carbon removal is an interesting question. I mean, on the one hand, if negotiations take a step back, and it's not voted no forever, it's postponed 1 year. So there is that moment now where diplomats or the negotiators will go back, and there will be a lot of new negotiations, and possibly CDR could be a part of it. But before we go there, we can take a step back and talk about CDR's role in shipping and aviation and everything that.
We'll get there, but do you really think this has a chance? I know that it's kind of a delay on paper, but from what I've seen, I mean, there's no reason that the dynamics that led to this now would change in the next year, right?
I haven't followed the negotiations and what the different delegations says close enough to know that. Some people seem to say that, it's just a delay. Others seem to see it as dead in the water. So yeah, I don't know.
And I'd love to come back to this just later when we think about multilateralism and climate, what it could potentially mean for aviation, for COSIA. But yeah, I'm sure we're going to get there. So maybe for those who have maybe even read but don't remember in detail, what are kind of your high-level takeaways from looking into maritime and aviation and the role that CDR can play in it?
Well, those two sectors need liquid fuel. It's really hard to completely electrify, especially aviation. And in one way or another, they're going to have to continue to use liquid fuel for a very, very long time, the rest of the century for sure. And then the question is, what fuels are the best? You have biofuels, but you also have electrofuels, which are made out of mostly hydrogen, and some of them, especially for aviation, they use CO2 as well to create, for example, electrokerosene, like a synthetic alternative, which is essentially the same thing as fossil fuels, but it's made from the air and from clean electricity. But then the cost of those electrofuels is very, very high, and for biofuels, it's limited by sustainable feedstock, even though there is theoretically enough sustainable feedstock to fill both of these sectors' need. It may be hard in practice to do. So then the question is, could CDR be a good option? And the difference between the cost of the clean alternative and the cost of CDR is the highest for these sectors compared to many others. So if you look at the cost of electrofuels, it can be today it can be more like $1,000 per ton, but also in the future it looks like a ton of CO2. It looks like it will be costing significantly more than durable carbon removal. And when we talk about aviation, you need CO2 in both places. So if you capture carbon, your cost is both in the electrofuel side and on the CDR side. So the cost of capture doesn't actually affect the comparison. For some e-fuels for shipping, like electro-ammonia, you don't use CO2, so there you don't have the same comparison. And overall, across a few different articles, I compared this, and there you have a calculator with all the assumptions in there, so you can go in and make your own changes and change the assumptions and see what you end up with. But essentially, if electricity is really cheap, like $30 per megawatt hour, then electric fuels is often the most competitive alternative. But at today's electricity prices, or even higher, carbon removal is cheaper. So it's two of the hardest to abate sectors, and two sectors where using CDR for at least part of the emissions makes most sense. But today, with today's legislation and today's policies, CDR is actually effectively shut out as a solution.
And I'll link to all these calculators and your articles in the show notes. I really love your focus in general, as you also reiterated Carbon Bound last week, on kind of essentially the lowest cost of abatement, right? It's an argument that for me resonates a lot, that we shouldn't just fix percentages. We should be just pragmatic and look at the actual costs of doing different things. But I want to quote from one of your articles, because playing devil's advocate a little bit, right? You say, given sufficient guardrails and quality, using sustainable biofuels or electrofuels, or using durable CDR to compensate for fossil fuel use, have equal effects on long-term atmospheric CO2 levels. And obviously what that leaves out is all the other negative repercussions of keeping a fossil fuel industry alive, right? And so I'm wondering, how have you thought through that? Because you're looking at purely from an atmospheric CO2 perspective, and the accounting makes sense. But what about all the rest? So yeah, I'm sure you've thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, everything that we do have externalities. And there are places where fossil fuel production is very clean. If you look at Norway, for example, or other places, that doesn't have huge externalities from the production. Of course, the CO2 has externalities, but the other sort of effects are not big. And when you talk about kind of soot emissions and the short-term warming effect of fossil fuels can cheaply be hydrotreated so that they burn very clean and remove all the aromatic content, and that's very cheap, and you can just legislate that that it should be done. And if you produce batteries, you need a lot of minerals. If you build a factory, you have some externalities with that. And I think legislation that is about the local environment should be strict and make sure that people are not harmed. And that goes for all types of solutions. It's not anything special with fossil fuels there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess when I see this argument made, I'm kind of resonate a lot with what you're saying. But I've seen the argument made that we need to essentially wind down the demand for fossil fuels in general, because of all the things that are not just petrol and fuels, but also plastics and chemicals and everything else, and how essentially keeping a lifeline to that sector can delay all the other bits that lead to pollution.
But you can also delay net zero if you try to be against fossil fuels. What's your target here? Is it to stop warming, or is it to get rid of fossil fuels? Because that's not the same thing. And I think that net zero is hard enough to achieve. Like, it doesn't look like the world will achieve net zero, 2050, maybe not even 2060, even if the EU could do it. And we need to make sure that we're able to do it as cheaply and fast as possible. And we should not put arbitrary obstacles in the way for doing so.
And I think if we want to make a switch, we started kind of with the multilateral global perspective, and there was some really bad news there, as we discussed. But there's been some really positive news, I would say, on this front coming out of the UK last week, right? And they are actually suggesting, I'm sure we're going to get into SAF mandates into much more detail, but they're suggesting in a greenhouse gas review that they released to shift from pure SAF mandate to essentially net zero mandate that could also open the door to removals. I know you've covered this as well on LinkedIn. What's your take on what is being suggested there?
So this resonates with what I've suggested for the EU as well, where there's a EU refuel mandate, which says that by 2050, 70% of the fuel that is uplifted into planes on EU territory, so not just what's covered by the ETS, it's actually much wider, should be covered by SAF. And 35% out of that, or half of that 70, so 35% of fuel, should be e-fuels, and half should be biofuels. So that doesn't leave any room for CDR. And actually, as it's written, because it's broader than the ETS, effectively, no, you don't really need any ETS credits either for these SAF, because you don't. ETS does not consider the life cycle emissions of SAF anyway. So there would be eventually zero demand for aviation in the EU ETS. And this goes for shipping too, with the Fuel EU Maritime, which is a similar legislation. It doesn't say how much sustainable fuel you should have, but it says that the emission intensity of the fuel has to go down with 80%. And what the UK then proposes is to go away from like a similar mandate that the EU has into a net zero mandate, where you're agnostic about which solution wins out. If you don't set fixed percentages, you allow carbon removal to compete in there as well. And I really don't favor carbon removal over e-fuels. I want to be very clear about that. I think e-fuels in many ways more attractive because like you get this domestic way of producing fuel, and like for security concerns that could be good that you produce fuels within your own borders. If you don't import them, I think China might dominate e-fuels as well. So like you still need to have some kind of domestic support for your e-fuel production. But I think that CDR should also be allowed to compete as a mitigation solution in its own right. Not better, not worse than anything else.
And it's quite interesting, right? Because when we look at the SAF mandates in the UK and EU, they're pretty aggressive. And when I spent quite a bit of time kind of talking to aviation folks early in the year, and there's a growing recognition that especially the 2030 targets are probably going to be missed, right? And that unless there's some major changes in the SAF industry, we might miss further follow-on targets as well. So it sounds like CDR could throw a lifeline there. The counter argument I've heard is if we integrate CDR too quickly or too much, will that delay or take away incentives to get especially eSAF actually going? So how do you see kind of that trade-off?
Yeah, I think you have to be clear what's your long-term, what are you planning for long-term and for what reason? So if you want domestic production for security reasons, then this mandate wouldn't be enough anyway, because like it allows for imports. So you would probably need some kind of domestic support and have targets for how much should be produced domestically of these e-fuels. And I think that's good, and that's something that can be done. But when it comes to the other side, like what you're allowed to be used, there I think you should be more agnostic. And today it's more of the central planning approach where you say exactly how much and by when and so on, and you don't let the economics and the market play a role in which solutions is being used.
And out of the two, because we've got the maritime and the aviation mandates in Europe, and as you said, I found it really interesting because they were developed almost at the same time, but one is focusing on energy, on the intensity, the energy intensity of the fuel. The other one is just saying you need to procure SAF. Do you have any idea kind of why they were designed differently? And what does that mean for CDR, I guess, if one is already focused on energy intensity?
Well, that's interesting. Like, I don't know this. I don't have any insights into the negotiations of why each developed in this way. What I've heard is the IMO was really scared of doing the same thing as aviation with CORSIA when they had. Also, carbon removal is allowed for aviation, but cheaper credits is also allowed, so carbon removal doesn't really have a role in CORSIA either. But the shipping folks were scared of copying aviation and wanted to shut out credits altogether, and then carbon removal was also shut out.
Interesting. One thing that I also ever wanted to know, but I want to link it to these two specific things that we just discussed. I saw that Fuel EU Maritime has a review in 2028, and the Refuel EU Aviation has a review in 2027. Which is really interesting, right? It means that we actually have, the CDR industry, we've got 2 or 3 years to mobilize for these reviews. So what's your call to arms, call to action for the CDR industry? What should we be doing in that time?
Actually, I think the CDR industry hasn't been that good at organizing and having like lobby groups for CDR in the way that other industries have. That takes place in these international negotiations. Who's going to do that? Like, I don't know, can we use the existing organizations like Carbon 180, very focused on the US, negative emissions platform is quite EU focused, and who can do it? Could it be Carbon Gap, or should it be like a new organization? But anyway, we need to make sure that CDR at least has a place at the table, because I don't think that carbon removal or durable carbon removal has been in the idea world of the decision makers. I don't think that they know it's a serious mitigation alternative. They're just thinking like, well, how do we solve these problems? And then, we need to have these alternative fuels. That's the only thing I think they can think of, honestly. I don't know, but that's my guess.
But it sounds like an idea, proposal that really fits the time that we're living in, right? Like if you look at the EU, there's constant desire now to introduce mechanisms in climate policy that keep competitiveness, that lower costs. And this is exactly what this is, right? So it sounds like we've got it cut out for us, and we just need to make sure that we're rallying the troops properly around this.
Yeah. And one thing that makes it easier in the EU, of course, is also the energy consumption. That it's already not that easy to produce huge amounts of electricity in the EU and add huge amounts of new capacity. And if you go strong for the e-fuel route, you need to expand it a lot. Like even if your conversion numbers are very optimistic, you still need a massive ramp up of electricity, which is much, much smaller, even if you go for full DAC for the CDR. So that's something that I can also make it easier, aside from the cost angle.
And if we go a bit deeper maritime, I want to switch to aviation in a second, but I know you've also looked at onboard CCS, which is something that is kind of being thrown around, and I hear quite a lot when it comes to this. What's your overall assessment of the attractiveness of onboard CCS?
Before I started researching it, I thought it was more like a loose idea that probably wouldn't work, but there's actually quite serious work being done on onboard CCS. So like you capture the emissions from the ship, store the CO2 during the voyage, and then you unload it in port. And that could be cheaper than CDR potentially, but we don't really know. But it has definitely potential to be at low cost. You do need infrastructure, a lot of infrastructure, like taking the CO2 in the ports, making sure it goes to final storage, and that's not easy, of course. So in any way, it would never cover like all shipping emissions. Like that would be extremely unrealistic. But on some routes and some where you have the ports connected, I could see it happening. And then you have other solutions like nuclear, for example, on board. So it's not like shipping has more options than aviation.
And on aviation, one thing we haven't talked about at all, well, almost at all yet, is the ETS, right? And in the EU ETS right now, only intra-EU flights are covered, which is 20% of the emissions of flights that reach or touch ground in Europe. So 80% is not covered. And in the consultation earlier this year, that was one of the questions, right? Like, should the EU kind of claw back all flights that start or depart or arrive in the EU? From what I understand, it's a highly political topic that could unleash a trade war. So it's something that is very, very tricky to do. But there's a huge opportunity with next year's proposal on the ETS in 2026 to potentially extend, what is covered in the EU ETS when it comes to aviation and the role of CDR. So have you looked at that nexus as well in your work?
Go a little bit. I think it was ruled out and we got CORSIA, but let's see how well that works now with CORSIA. And it's limited as well in how much it covers. It's only like excess emissions from 2019 baselines. So I think it's possible. And there are groups like Opportunity Green, for example, like an NGO, that's lobbying for inclusion of all of these flights into the EU ETS. And I would like to see that as well. How feasible it is, I think there's a good chance. I don't know how big, I can't quantify it exactly, but like there is a window of opportunity, I think.
I remember we did a policy scoop, I put it in the show notes, on aviation and EU ETS specifically. And I remember Eve telling me that last time the EU tried to do this, China and the US went bananas at them. And this is pre-Trump US. So given what's happening, I could imagine that flights from the US to Europe, it would be quite hard to do it. At the same time, if we look at CORSIA, again, from talking to a lot of folks about CORSIA, it's not net zero aligned, right? It as you said, it's not net zero aligned. So it's not at all equivalent to the EU ETS. And beyond that, the quality of what you can, the only project that exists in CORSIA right now in Guyana, I think, is a pretty questionable, highly criticized project, and that's it. So it's hard to justify that we shouldn't bring those flights back into the EU ETS from a climate perspective. But yeah, it sounds like it might be an uphill battle with the current geopolitics.
Yeah, but at the Refuel EU was, I guess, accepted by people, even though it maybe it's in a smart way, covers a lot of the same emissions, because it's about what you uplift on EU territory when you fuel up your plane. And maybe that could also be a way of covering it all and integrating CDR into that mandate. But I think there are many ways to do this. You need probably to be smart about it to get it to fly.
Do you see potential for durable removals in CORSIA? Because I know that isometrics have been pre-approved, but my understanding is it's a race to the bottom price-wise. So
the removals
what's
are
your
allowed
take?
in CORSIA.
In theory.
It's just that, I mean, if there's no demand, if there's no supply of cheaper credits and there's supply of durable removal, maybe a little bit will be sold of durable removal, but that's still like a stretch. I think one proposal is then to make sure that CORSIA is 100% durable removal by 2050, and that it shifts over to that.
By 2050?
Yeah. That could be, a way to do it, that it shifts over to only durable removal. Because, I mean, as far as I understand, CORSIA it has corresponding adjustments. So you do have that. It's not just a regular credit, it's like an old school traditional carbon credit. You do have that where the host country is not supposed to, they're not going to count it. So it is better quality in that sense, that you have the higher additionality. And so it's not like it's crap credits or anything, like in CORSIA, I think, per definition. So, but by 2050, the whole world is supposed to be net zero anyway, so it would make sense that it's only durable carbon removal left. So you could have that as a kind of a ramp up to make sure that you get the supply as well.
Have you seen, do you have any intelligence on appetite for this in the aviation industry? Because when I spoke to them, it doesn't seem like this is anywhere on their agenda to kind of that shift that you're describing.
That's why we need better CDR lobbyists. Or we need CDR lobbyists, period.
Yeah. No, I agree. Okay, so what else is out there? Because when I look at it, I see kind of at the global level, we had this maritime net zero framework, which has now been delayed. We've got an aviation net zero target, which hopefully will stay. Let's see. Then we've got kind of regional ETS, and we've got the SAF mandates in the UK and EU. Is there anything else that you've stumbled upon that, when it comes to CDR, could be interesting?
Well, it's a good target for voluntary compensation, and companies could start doing this immediately. Like you can see shipping and aviation as residual emissions that's going to remain even at your net zero target year. And you could start compensating for them with durable carbon removal right now. Like, you take your measures to reduce aviation, of course, by video meetings and less conferences and all that. But you can already now know that a big part of your aviation emissions and shipping as well, is going to remain. So you could start compensating for that with durable carbon removal right now. We see some of that happening. And we also see some airlines, some shipping companies buying durable CDR. You can find them on the CDR.FYI leaderboards. So a little bit of movement there. But I think, we were also hampered by the kind of, only 10%. But for many companies that are not manufacturing, these shipping, especially aviation, is a very large part of emissions. If you're in consulting or like so that's something that we really should be doing now, because that's ongoing emissions that just continues to contribute to warming. Like if you're going to fly, you're going to have to buy carbon removal. But I don't even think that people in the industry buy CDR for their flights. Some do, like I do, but not everyone does, I think.
It's really just a quick side note, right? But it's one of my pet peeves with this industry. And whenever I write about this, I'm so surprised. Those are the posts I get the least engagement on.
Just like
no, seriously. And all the B2C companies that are trying to make this work have gone bust. It's really, really, really tricky. And I find it crazy that, for example, we still have conferences and companies that are not offsetting for their emissions in CDR. Yeah, call to action to everyone out there. You really have to compensate your travel emissions if you're working in CDR. Everything else is a bit hypocritical.
Yeah, and I think also that travel emissions fit very well into like operational net zero. Like Schneider Electric, for example, has an operational net zero. I'm not sure if they include travel or not, but like scope 1, 2, and travel, arguably. I mean, business travel doesn't really. It's not like the rest of scope 3 emissions. Like you do control it quite a lot, so it should be in your operational part, and reaching a near-term net zero for operational emissions, including business travel, I think makes a lot of sense.
What I find, coming back to the aviation industry, I find it really encouraging the role that Airbus and Boeing are trying to play here, because they have such a multiplier and network effect in the industry, right? And they both very proactive when it comes to carbon removal. So yeah, that gives me hope, and hopefully they will be able to convince a couple of airlines through the distribution channels.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes to go, and actually one big topic that we haven't touched yet on is what carbon removal, right? Because I remember that, for example, there's a Concito report which actually covered a lot of similar ground to what you wrote about, and they made the same case as you, but they said it should only be direct air capture, right? And I wanted to ask you, like, what type of carbon removal we should consider when we're talking about kind of this lower abatement cost for maritime and aviation.
Yeah, well, we had a separate episode about the like-for-like principle that people can go back to, and it's essentially that's the answer. Because here we're talking about ongoing fossil fuels, and you're doing CDR instead. That's what we're describing here. And then you really need durable carbon removal to offset fossil fuel emissions. And I do not think that DAX is the only durable CDR that's available out there. I think that you can do sustainable BECCS. I think you biochar, high-quality biochar is included there. There are ocean solutions as well. That's where the MRB is maturing into it and has rock weathering as well. So those kind of durable CDR solutions. But I don't think planting trees in a way where there's a risk of reversibility, and it's also a one-time thing that you can do on land, is not enough to willfully continue to burn fossil fuels. It needs to be durable in that case.
And I guess we're developing frameworks hopefully for that. For the EU, for example, the CSCF could hopefully be a good platform for that.
Yeah, for sure.
Can you talk about contrails a little bit? How does that feature into this discussion?
So it's very short-term warming.
Exactly.
So and you can adjust it a little bit by flight paths, and especially in the nighttime and over the cold areas, you get more contrails. SAF also gives contrails, but a little bit less because it's burns cleaner. But you can hydrotreat fossil fuels very cheaply to get rid of the aromatic content. So essentially, it becomes the same as SAF. And we should do that. We should legislate that kerosene should be aromatically treated.
But so far on contrails, I haven't looked into this at all. Is there any legislation in the things that we discussed today that is addressing the contrails?
Not to my knowledge. But they are very short term. So it doesn't affect the Paris Agreement, the long term. It doesn't make the problem worse long term. It only affects warming right now.
But if it keeps going, the right now becomes also a longer period of time, right? So it does.
Yeah, but
if you don't get a handle on it.
If we continue to emit fossil fuels between now and 2050 and then we solve it, we still have a big problem because all that CO2 remains. If we continue to do contrails until now in 2050 and then we solve it, problem's gone.
Yeah.
That's the difference.
Fair. What do we not talk about? Maybe also stuff that you've worked on that you found interesting. You dove into these two sectors, probably quite curious. What did we talk about that surprised you?
I had some calculators on marginalcarbon.com that you can see you can easily, you don't have to go to the full calculating document, you can compare costs, and you can also see the volumes. So which can be interesting for listeners that if carbon removal would cover 50% of aviation in 2050 with kind of expected both increase in demand but also increase in efficiency, so it goes down, then we would talk about 600-700 million tons of CDR. For aviation, so it's not an extreme amount, and
still
if it
reasonable amount, yeah.
Yes, but it's not any gigatons. And for marine CDR, if it covered half of the expected demand, they were talking 400 million tons, and then for aviation, we'd need another 160 million tons to make 10% e-fuels, if in this example, or 250 if it was 20% e-fuels.
And it's interesting, maybe just a reminder, ICAO estimates that offsets would contribute, I think, 19% at net zero.
Yeah.
So it's quite a big difference between kind of what the aviation industry thinks they need.
And they only look at the life cycle of the SAF. That's what they use CDR for. But there's no legislation that cares about that. So there's no compliance measures to care about the life cycle. So that's more from a scope-free perspective that you think about that. Not a compliance
Super interesting. What's next for you? Are you going to go deeper into these sectors? And if yes, where? Or are you starting to focus on maybe another sector?
Well, we'll see. there's a little bit of work left, and then I'll probably, see what happens and continue. There's a lot of lobby work to be done. I don't know how much of that I can do myself, but I hope others also pick up the idea. But otherwise, I think that this is touching on this like question where to use CDR, and there's an upcoming paper that's been upcoming for a very long time. I hope we get published soon, like on the carbon gap, where to use CDR. Where that goes deeper into this and looking at like where does it make sense to use CDR as a solution. Yeah, some things will be in that paper, other things I'll probably publish myself, where I have pointier arguments. Essentially, I think that the market should play a really big role in determining where CDR should be used, given sufficient guardrails.
I think it's an argument worth sharing right now. Thanks for that. We'll have you back on when the carbon gap paper comes out. And thank you, Robert. This was great.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on again.